Castoriadis in the context of post-Socialist Eastern Europe. By Yavor Tarinski. Quote, "It's true that in Eastern Europe at the moment, people can't think of anything except a liberal capitalist society. Almost everything else has disappeared from the horizon. You can't even pronounce a word which starts with S, enough of it. Any word. This is the negative outside of it." End quote. Cornelius Castoriadis. That quote is from a book called A Critical Sense, Interviews with Intellectuals, edited by Peter Osborne in 1996. This year marks the 98th year since the birth of the philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis, as well as 23 years from his death. This time represents a long period in which much has changed, but somewhat his thought remains relevant and as fresh as during those rebellious days and nights of May 1968, when the Parisian youth, influenced to a large extent by Castoriadis and his associates, challenged the dominant and bankrupt significations of that period, proposing instead a new and radical narrative rooted in one democratic tradition. But if drastic changes have taken place in the Western world where Castoriadis lived and worked, such change has unfolded also, if not even to a higher degree in Eastern Europe. Much can be said about that, but I will limit myself to a few notes here. The post-Soviet era came with promises for blurry notions of, quote, freedom, end quote, that irritated the social imaginary after many decades under the iron grip of centralized bureaucratic apparatuses. But the changes that came brought fragmented bureaucratic capitalism that deepened further the already severe crisis of civic culture. This was no surprise for Castoriadis, who himself was never fooled by the so-called free world of the West and neither by the labeled People's Republics of the East. Furthermore, his analysis on the effects of social pacification would have on the power relations inside society offers clear explanation for the grotesque forms of social organization in contemporary Eastern Europe. For Castoriadis, the withdrawal of people from the public sphere and the disappearance of political and social conflict allows the economic, political, and media oligarchy to escape all public control. Cornelius Castoriadis, A Society Adrift. These processes are being unfolded in extreme rapidity in the countries of Eastern Europe, where people have first-handedly experienced both Soviet-style socialism, state capitalism, and corporate capitalism. As a result of these social conditions, the imaginaries of these societies were submerged into deep cynicism, arguably worse than the alienation of the Western consumerist culture. Thus, regimes are being produced whose irrationality is pushed to the extreme and which are riddled with unseeingly unhidden structural corruption. In this significationless environment, traditional ideological projects seem impotent to provide germs for the emergence of new significations which could give once again life to these societies, which have descended into deep cynical lethargy. Instead, they are often used as tools by elitist circles to abdicate from broad public affairs. Besides this, for decades, the established powers in these countries have exercised their iron grip on power under Marxist ideology. Thus, local populations have grown extremely wary, if not even hostile, towards notions such as people power, internationalism, and revolution. Meanwhile, the post-socialist governments, in their efforts at enforcing their new Western capitalist ideology, made everything in their powers Meanwhile, in the post-socialist governments, in their efforts at enforcing their new Western capitalist ideology, made everything in their power to erase the past. Thus, extreme tribal nationalism rose among the local populations to fill the gap left from this sense of uprootedness. Alternative political activities remained to their bigger part entrapped in the ideological narratives of times long gone, referring to realities of the 19th and 20th centuries, not corresponding to the new temporalities. Thus, dissenting voices were channeled through ideological sects that fit the description given by Castoriadis as groups that set up as an absolute, a single side, aspect or phase of the movement it stems from, making this aspect the truth of the doctrine and the truth as such, subordinating everything else to it, and in order to maintain its, quote, faithfulness, end quote, to this aspect, severs itself radically from the world, living henceforth in, quote, its, end quote, own world. That's from The Imaginary Institution of Society. Somewhere in this harsh environment, I was introduced to the thought of Cornelius Castoriadis and the project of autonomy, its potentials for challenging the present-day oligarchies in their new liberal clothing, with the non-ideological paradigm of direct democracy, were impressive. Even more so was its radical break with economism that has left such corrosive effects on the imaginary of Eastern European people. As Castoriadis noted, the doctrine of the socialist regimes borrowed heavily from capitalism's imaginary that bases all over social life. As Castoriadis noted, the doctrine of the socialist regimes borrowed heavily from capitalism's imaginary that bases all of social life on the idea that economic, quote, betterment, end quote, was the only thing that counted or that would yield the rest by addition. This imaginary continued to be vulgarly pushed forward by pro-Western oligarchies that took power in the post-Soviet era. Thus, economism sedimented among large sections of Eastern European societies, replacing citizens with taxpayers and dulling creativity with cynical consumerism. The project of autonomy, advocated by Castoriadis, represented a radical break with it, as well as with traditional ideological sectarianism, thereby plaguing the social movements in Eastern Europe. It also offered rootedness in one democratic historical tradition, which was to replace the shallow tribal nationalism. Man, I'm fucking up today. Castoriadis called for people to engage in political affairs and to recreate the public space and time that has been severely and continuously degraded by the party commissars of the past and the business oligarchs of the present. It is not by chance that Castoriadis' thought reached these societies too late. Both the socialist censorship and the cannibalistic market have made it difficult for such ideas to make it through. Instead, his thought reached us, quote, from below, end quote, and here I write especially for the Bulgarian context in which I have spent most of my life, through activist channels and international exchange of ideas with social movements from neighboring countries. However, during recent years, his ideas have begun to reach a growing number of people in Eastern Europe. Books of his are being published and political activities are taking place most influenced by his concepts of autonomy and democracy. A new generation of political thought and action is emerging in this part of the world that only time will show what alternative projects will appear in the future and what effect they will cast on these societies.